Question 1. Benchmark analysis indicates that the test of essential academic skills, TEAS, requires candidates to demonstrate understanding of geometric principles, including angles and their relationships, through clear and accurate visual representations. When preparing illustrative materials for a study guide, which of the following approaches best aligns with the regulatory framework for the TEAS, ensuring accurate depiction of supplementary angles? Option A. A diagram depicting two angles that appear to form a straight line, but with labels suggesting their sum is slightly less than 180 degrees. Option B. An illustration clearly showing two adjacent angles that form a straight line, with labels indicating they sum to 180 degrees. Option C. A drawing of two angles that clearly do not form a straight line, with a label stating they are supplementary. Option D. A visual representation of two angles that are not adjacent, with no clear indication of their combined measure, but with a general statement about angles. The correct answer is B. An illustration clearly showing two adjacent angles that form a straight line, with labels indicating they sum to 180 degrees. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to interpret and apply regulatory guidelines concerning the presentation of information, specifically focusing on the visual representation of angles and their relationships, within a context that could be subject to misinterpretation or misleading representation. The challenge lies in ensuring that the visual aids used are not only accurate, but also comply with the spirit and letter of the regulations designed to prevent confusion or deception. Careful judgment is required to select the most appropriate representation that adheres to the specified regulatory framework. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes clarity, accuracy, and adherence to the test of essential academic skills, TEAS, regulatory framework. By selecting an option that accurately depicts the relationship between angles without introducing ambiguity or misrepresentation, the professional demonstrates a commitment to upholding the standards of the examination. This aligns with the regulatory intent to assess fundamental academic skills in a fair and unambiguous manner. An incorrect approach that misrepresents the relationship between angles, for example, by showing supplementary angles that do not add up to 180 degrees, would constitute a regulatory failure. This is because it directly violates the principle of accurate representation of mathematical concepts, which is fundamental to the TEAS. Ethically, such a misrepresentation could lead to a candidate misunderstanding the concept, thereby compromising the integrity of the assessment. Similarly, an approach that uses an illustration that is technically correct but unnecessarily complex or confusing, thereby hindering understanding, could also be considered a failure to meet the spirit of the regulations, which aim for clear assessment of foundational skills. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the relevant regulatory framework, including any specific guidelines on visual aids or the presentation of mathematical concepts. Professionals must critically evaluate each potential approach against these regulations, considering not only technical accuracy, but also the potential for misinterpretation or misleading implications. Prioritizing clarity, accuracy, and adherence to the assessment's objectives is paramount. Question 2. Regulatory review indicates a need to verify specific financial performance metrics for a recent reporting period. An accompanying document includes a bar graph illustrating quarterly revenue figures, which approach best ensures accurate compliance with the reporting requirement. Option A. Infer the overall revenue trend from the graph and provide a general statement about the company's performance. Option B. Disregard the graph and rely on previous knowledge of the company's typical revenue patterns. Option C. Focus on the visual appeal of the bar graph and describe its general shape and color scheme. Option D. Carefully examine the graph's axes and data points to identify the precise revenue figures for each quarter, then report these specific values. The correct answer is D. Carefully examine the graph's axes and data points to identify the precise revenue figures for each quarter, then report these specific values. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to interpret and apply information presented in a non-prose format, specifically a graph, within the context of regulatory compliance. The challenge lies in accurately extracting the relevant data from the visual representation and understanding its implications for reporting requirements, without misinterpreting the graphical elements or their associated labels. Careful judgment is required to ensure the extracted information is precise and directly addresses the regulatory inquiry. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly engages with the visual data presented in the graph. By carefully examining the axes, data points, and any accompanying legends or notes, the professional can accurately extract the specific figures needed. This method ensures that the information provided is grounded in the source material and directly addresses the regulatory requirement for specific data points. This aligns with the regulatory expectation of diligence and accuracy in reporting. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves relying solely on a general understanding of the graph's trend without extracting specific data points. This fails to meet the regulatory requirement for precise figures and introduces a risk of misrepresentation, as trends can be misleading without exact values. This is a failure of diligence and accuracy. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the graph entirely and attempt to answer based on prior knowledge or assumptions about similar data. This is a significant regulatory and ethical failure, as it bypasses the provided evidence and introduces the risk of providing outdated or incorrect information. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the specific information presented. A further incorrect approach is to focus on the visual aesthetics of the graph rather than its data. This demonstrates a misunderstanding of the purpose of graphical representations in a regulatory context, which is to convey factual information. It is an ethical failure to prioritize form over substance, leading to inaccurate or incomplete reporting. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such a scenario should adopt a systematic approach. First, they must identify the specific information requested by the regulatory body. Second, they should locate the relevant text feature, in this case, the graph, that is most likely to contain this information. Third, they must meticulously examine the feature, paying close attention to all labels, scales, data points, and any explanatory notes. Finally, they should extract the precise data required and cross-reference it with the regulatory request to ensure complete and accurate compliance. This process emphasizes accuracy, diligence, and adherence to the provided information. Question 3. The audit findings indicate a potential discrepancy in the documentation of client interactions, suggesting that some client communication records may not fully reflect the substance of discussions. Which of the following approaches best addresses this finding by identifying supporting details? Option A. Relying on the auditor's general observation that some records are likely insufficient without further investigation. Option B. Immediately updating all client interaction recording protocols to a more stringent standard, assuming the auditor's observation is universally applicable. Option C. Asking the client directly if they believe their interaction records are adequate. Option D. Reviewing a sample of client interaction logs and associated documentation to identify specific instances where the recorded information appears incomplete or inconsistent with the nature of the interaction. The correct answer is D. Reviewing a sample of client interaction logs and associated documentation to identify specific instances where the recorded information appears incomplete or inconsistent with the nature of the interaction. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the audit findings, while identifying a potential issue, are not definitive. The auditor has provided observations that suggest a deviation from expected practice, but the exact nature and impact of this deviation require further investigation. The challenge lies in determining the appropriate level of detail and the specific supporting evidence needed to substantiate the audit finding without overreacting or dismissing the auditor's concerns. Careful judgment is required to balance the need for thoroughness with the efficient use of resources. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the auditor's observation by seeking specific, tangible evidence that corroborates the finding. This involves reviewing the documentation and processes that the auditor has flagged. By focusing on identifying supporting details, the professional is demonstrating due diligence and a commitment to understanding the root cause of the potential issue. This aligns with the professional obligation to ensure accuracy and compliance, as expected in any regulated environment where audits are conducted to maintain standards. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the auditor's opinion without seeking corroborating evidence fails to meet professional standards. It risks making decisions based on assumptions rather than facts, which could lead to incorrect conclusions or unnecessary actions. This could be seen as a failure to exercise professional skepticism, a core ethical principle. Another incorrect approach that dismisses the auditor's findings without proper investigation is also professionally unacceptable. This demonstrates a lack of respect for the audit process and could indicate a deliberate attempt to overlook potential issues. Such an approach could violate ethical guidelines related to integrity and objectivity, and potentially regulatory requirements for responding to audit observations. A further incorrect approach that involves broad generalizations or assumptions about the underlying cause, without specific evidence, is also problematic. This lacks the precision required for effective problem solving and could lead to misdirected efforts. It fails to provide the concrete details necessary for a clear understanding and resolution of the issue. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, thoroughly understand the auditor's specific observations and the context in which they were made. Second, identify the types of evidence that would either support or refute these observations. Third, actively seek out and review this evidence. Fourth, analyze the evidence objectively to determine the validity and impact of the audit finding. Finally, based on the analyzed evidence, formulate a reasoned response and appropriate actions, ensuring that all decisions are grounded in factual support. Question 4. The performance metrics show a significant dip in engagement with the latest academic resources, and the accompanying note states, "It is imperative that we understand the root causes of this decline to ensure our students are receiving the most effective learning experiences." What is the author's primary purpose in this communication? Option A. To highlight the author's own efforts in developing academic resources, implying they are not the cause of the decline. Option B. To express disappointment and assign blame for the observed decline in student engagement. Option C. To dismiss the performance metrics as an anomaly and avoid further discussion on the topic. Option D. To prompt an investigation into the reasons for decreased student engagement and to encourage a proactive response to address it. The correct answer is D. To prompt an investigation into the reasons for decreased student engagement and to encourage a proactive response to address it. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires interpreting the underlying intent and emotional stance of a communication, rather than just its literal content. The performance metrics, while objective data, are presented in a way that could be perceived as critical or accusatory. A professional must discern whether the author's purpose is to genuinely inform and improve, or to assign blame and create a negative atmosphere. This requires careful judgment to avoid misinterpreting the tone and responding defensively or inappropriately, which could damage team morale and hinder constructive feedback. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves recognizing that the author's purpose is likely to highlight areas for improvement and to encourage a proactive response. The tone, while potentially perceived as direct, is intended to be constructive. This approach represents best professional practice because it aligns with principles of open communication and continuous improvement, which are often implicitly or explicitly encouraged by professional bodies and ethical guidelines in many academic and professional settings. By focusing on the underlying purpose of improvement, a professional can engage with the feedback constructively, seek clarification if needed, and contribute to positive change, thereby upholding professional integrity and fostering a productive environment. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to interpret the author's purpose as purely critical and accusatory, leading to a defensive or dismissive tone in response. This fails to acknowledge the potential for constructive intent and can create unnecessary conflict, violating ethical principles of collegiality and professional respect. Such a response might also be seen as a failure to engage with feedback, which could have implications for professional development and performance reviews, depending on the specific institutional guidelines. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the performance metrics altogether, assuming they are irrelevant or unimportant. This demonstrates a lack of engagement with feedback and a disregard for data-driven insights, which can be detrimental to professional growth and organizational effectiveness. Ethically, it suggests a lack of accountability and a failure to contribute to collective improvement efforts. A third incorrect approach is to focus solely on the negative aspects of the metrics without seeking to understand the context or potential solutions. This can lead to a pessimistic outlook and a failure to identify opportunities for positive action. It may also be perceived as a lack of problem-solving initiative, which is a key professional competency. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach communications, especially those involving performance data, with a mindset of inquiry and a commitment to understanding. The decision-making process should involve 1. Identifying the explicit content of the communication. 2. Considering the potential underlying purpose and tone, asking what is the author trying to achieve, and what is the emotional undercurrent. 3. Evaluating the context in which the communication is delivered. 4. Formulating a response that is professional, constructive, and addresses the core message, seeking clarification where necessary. 5. Prioritizing actions that lead to improvement and demonstrate accountability. Question 5. Implementation of a new compliance policy requires a thorough understanding of a lengthy internal audit report detailing potential procedural gaps. Which approach to summarizing this report best demonstrates professional competence and adherence to regulatory principles? Option A. Focus the summary on the sections of the report that discuss the historical context of the procedures, as this provides valuable background information. Option B. Rephrase the introductory and concluding paragraphs of the audit report, as these sections typically contain the main points. Option C. Create a summary that highlights the most significant procedural gaps identified, explaining their potential impact on regulatory compliance and outlining the immediate steps recommended for remediation. Option D. Extract all sentences that mention the word risk and present them as the core of the summary, as this indicates the most critical findings. The correct answer is C. Create a summary that highlights the most significant procedural gaps identified, explaining their potential impact on regulatory compliance, and outlining the immediate steps recommended for remediation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to distill complex information into a concise and accurate summary, a skill fundamental to effective communication and decision-making within any regulated environment. The challenge lies in identifying the core message, relevant details, and potential implications without misrepresenting the original content or omitting critical information. Careful judgment is required to balance brevity with completeness, ensuring the summary is both understandable and actionable. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it demonstrates a thorough understanding of the source material and the ability to synthesize it effectively. It prioritizes accuracy, clarity, and relevance, ensuring that the summary serves its intended purpose without introducing bias or misinterpretation. This aligns with professional standards of diligence and competence, where clear and precise communication is paramount for compliance and operational efficiency. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the most alarming aspects of the report, while omitting mitigating factors, would be professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a lack of objectivity and a potential for sensationalism, which can lead to misinformed decisions and a distorted understanding of the situation. Ethically, it breaches the duty of candor and accuracy. Another incorrect approach, which merely rephrases sentences from the original report without identifying the overarching themes or key takeaways, fails to provide a true summary. This approach lacks analytical depth and does not add value beyond a superficial rearrangement of words. It demonstrates a lack of critical thinking and an inability to grasp the essence of the information, potentially leading to a misunderstanding of the report's significance. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve first understanding the purpose of the summary and the intended audience. Next, a careful reading and comprehension of the source material is essential, identifying key arguments, findings, and conclusions. Then, the information should be organized logically, focusing on the most critical elements. Finally, the summary should be reviewed for accuracy, clarity, and conciseness, ensuring it faithfully represents the original content and meets the stated purpose. Question 6. The monitoring system demonstrates a consistent pattern of misclassifying informational content. A particular passage which presents a series of facts and explanations about the process of photosynthesis is frequently flagged as a narrative. Which of the following best describes the primary error in this classification? Option A. The passage is persuasive, attempting to convince the reader of a particular viewpoint. Option B. The passage is procedural, detailing a step-by-step process without any explanatory context. Option C. The passage is expository, aiming to explain a concept, not to tell a story. Option D. The passage is descriptive, focusing solely on sensory details without a clear purpose. The correct answer is C. The passage is expository, aiming to explain a concept, not to tell a story. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the accurate identification of text types within a system designed for educational assessment. The Test of Essential Academic Skills, TEAS, is designed to evaluate foundational academic skills, and understanding how different text types are presented and assessed is crucial for both test creators and test takers. The challenge lies in distinguishing between texts that aim to inform expository, tell a story narrative, or convince an audience persuasive, as the skills required to comprehend and respond to each differ significantly. Careful judgment is needed to ensure the assessment accurately reflects a candidate's ability to engage with diverse informational sources. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it aligns with the core principles of standardized testing and educational assessment. By accurately categorizing texts, test developers can ensure that the questions posed are appropriate for the text type and effectively measure the intended academic skills. This adherence to accurate classification is implicitly supported by the TEAS commitment to evaluating essential academic skills, which necessitates a clear understanding of how information is presented and conveyed. The ethical imperative is to provide a fair and valid assessment, and this begins with a foundational understanding of the material being presented. An incorrect approach that misidentifies an expository text as narrative would be professionally unacceptable because it would lead to the development of assessment questions that are misaligned with the text's purpose and structure. For example, questions designed to assess plot development or character arcs would be irrelevant to an expository text focused on explaining a scientific concept. This failure to accurately classify the text type undermines the validity of the assessment, potentially leading to an inaccurate evaluation of a candidate's comprehension skills. Ethically, this constitutes a failure to provide a fair and accurate test. Another incorrect approach, mistaking a persuasive text for an expository one, would similarly lead to flawed assessment design. Questions focused on identifying factual data or explaining processes would be inappropriate for a text primarily aiming to influence the reader's opinion or encourage a specific action. This misclassification would not only fail to measure the candidate's ability to analyze argumentative strategies, but also misrepresent their understanding of expository writing. This is a direct violation of the professional responsibility to create assessments that accurately measure the skills they purport to evaluate. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic review of the text's primary purpose, organizational structure, and linguistic features. Professionals should ask, is the text primarily intended to inform, entertain, or persuade? Does it follow a chronological order, a cause and effect structure, or a problem-solution format? What is the dominant tone and style? By answering these questions, one can confidently determine the text type and ensure that subsequent assessment design is appropriate and valid, thereby upholding professional standards and ethical obligations. Question 7. Benchmark analysis indicates that the Test of Essential Academic Skills, TEAS, regulatory framework emphasizes precise numerical representation in its assessment of foundational academic skills. When reporting data that must strictly adhere to the definition of whole numbers as outlined in the TEAS guidelines, which of the following actions best demonstrates compliance with the regulatory intent? Option A. Using a mix of exact whole numbers and commonly accepted approximations for quantities that are typically measured in fractions, such as reporting half as 0.5. Option B. Including figures that contain decimal points, as long as they represent quantities that are conceptually whole in a broader sense, such as 3.0 for 3 items. Option C. Rounding any figures that are not exact integers to the nearest whole number, regardless of whether the original value is a fraction or a decimal. Option D. Ensuring all reported figures are expressed as integers, with no fractional or decimal components, and without any form of approximation or rounding that deviates from the exact value. The correct answer is D. Ensuring all reported figures are expressed as integers, with no fractional or decimal components, and without any form of approximation or rounding that deviates from the exact value. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to interpret and apply regulatory requirements concerning whole numbers in a context that is not purely mathematical, but has practical implications for financial reporting and compliance. The core difficulty lies in understanding the intent and scope of whole numbers as defined by the Test of Essential Academic Skills, TEAS, regulatory framework, which likely emphasizes accuracy and integrity in data representation. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it adheres strictly to the established regulatory definition of whole numbers within the TEAS framework. This ensures that all reported figures are accurate, unambiguous, and comply with the standards set for the examination. By correctly identifying and utilizing whole numbers, the individual demonstrates a foundational understanding of data integrity, a critical element in many professional fields assessed by the TEAS. This aligns with the regulatory expectation of precision and adherence to defined parameters. An incorrect approach that includes fractional or decimal values fails to meet the regulatory definition of whole numbers. This represents a failure in understanding and applying fundamental numerical concepts as stipulated by the TEAS. Such an error could lead to misrepresentation of data, inaccurate reporting, and ultimately, a failure to meet the examination standards. Ethically, it demonstrates a lack of diligence and attention to detail, which are paramount in any professional setting where numerical data is handled. Another incorrect approach might involve rounding numbers inappropriately or selectively. While rounding is a mathematical operation, its application must be governed by the specific rules and context provided by the TEAS framework. If the framework mandates the use of exact whole numbers, any form of rounding that introduces approximation would be a regulatory failure. This highlights a misunderstanding of the strictness of the TEAS requirements and a potential over-reliance on general mathematical practices without considering specific regulatory constraints. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough review of the TEAS regulatory framework's definitions and guidelines related to numerical representation. Professionals must prioritize understanding the precise meaning of terms like whole numbers within the given regulatory context. They should then apply these definitions rigorously to the task at hand, cross-referencing their interpretation with any provided examples or clarifications within the framework. If ambiguity exists, seeking clarification from the examination administrators or referring to official guidance is a crucial step to ensure compliance and uphold professional integrity. Question 8. The monitoring system demonstrates an anomalous spike in transaction volume originating from a specific IP address. What is the most appropriate initial step in assessing the risk associated with this observation? Option A. Investigate the nature and context of the anomalous transaction volume, considering its potential impact on business operations and client security. Option B. Immediately flag the IP address as malicious and block all associated traffic to prevent potential security breaches. Option C. Report the anomaly directly to the Chief Information Security Officer without any preliminary analysis. Option D. Assume the spike is a temporary system error and disregard it unless it recurs frequently. The correct answer is A. Investigate the nature and context of the anomalous transaction volume, considering its potential impact on business operations and client security. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires interpreting complex data from a monitoring system to assess risk. The term anomalous is subjective and requires careful contextual understanding to determine its significance. Misinterpreting this data could lead to inadequate risk mitigation, potentially exposing the firm and its clients to financial or reputational harm. The challenge lies in moving beyond a superficial understanding of the vocabulary to a deep, context-aware assessment of potential implications. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the anomalous activity within its specific operational context. This means considering the nature of the activity, its frequency, potential impact, and the firm's risk appetite. This aligns with the principles of robust risk management, which necessitates understanding the nuances of data and identifying potential threats. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing financial services, mandate proactive risk identification and mitigation. A deep understanding of vocabulary and context ensures that the firm is not merely reacting to alerts, but is actively assessing and managing potential risks in line with its compliance obligations and ethical duties to protect client interests. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to dismiss the anomaly as a minor technical glitch without further investigation. This fails to acknowledge the potential for even seemingly small deviations to indicate underlying systemic issues or emerging threats. Ethically, this demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the firm's responsibility to maintain secure and reliable operations. It could also violate regulatory requirements for monitoring and reporting suspicious activities. Another incorrect approach would be to immediately escalate the anomaly to senior management without any preliminary analysis. While prompt reporting is important, doing so without understanding the context or potential severity of the anomaly can lead to unnecessary alarm and inefficient use of senior resources. This approach demonstrates a lack of independent judgment and an over-reliance on others to interpret data, which is a failure in professional responsibility. It may also indicate a misunderstanding of the firm's internal escalation protocols, which often require a level of initial assessment. A third incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the technical definition of anomalous, without considering the business implications. This demonstrates a superficial understanding of the term and its relevance to risk assessment. The regulatory and ethical imperative is to understand how technical anomalies translate into business risks, such as potential fraud, data breaches, or operational disruption. Failing to make this connection means the firm is not effectively managing its risks. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by first seeking to understand the specific context of the data. This involves asking clarifying questions about the monitoring system, the type of data being generated, and the normal operating parameters. Next, they should apply their knowledge of the business and its associated risks to evaluate the potential impact of the anomaly. This analytical process should be guided by the firm's risk management policies and relevant regulatory requirements. If the initial assessment indicates a potential risk, a structured escalation process should be followed, providing clear and concise information to facilitate informed decision-making by others. Question 9. Investigation of a research paper's introduction reveals that the author emphasizes the economic benefits of a new policy while downplaying potential social drawbacks. The author uses strong, positive adjectives to describe the policy's economic impact and quotes several industry leaders who stand to gain financially. However, the paper briefly mentions potential job displacement in a single sentence, without providing supporting data or further discussion. Which of the following best describes the author's perspective and potential bias in this text? Option A. The author demonstrates a clear bias towards the economic advantages of the policy, potentially overlooking or minimizing its social implications due to a pro-economic development perspective. Option B. The author is neutral and objective, presenting all information without any discernible perspective or bias. Option C. The author is primarily concerned with the social consequences of the policy, using economic data to support this viewpoint. Option D. The author presents a balanced view, acknowledging both economic benefits and social drawbacks with equal weight. The correct answer is A. The author demonstrates a clear bias towards the economic advantages of the policy, potentially overlooking or minimizing its social implications due to a pro-economic development perspective. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the candidate to critically evaluate information presented in a text, specifically identifying potential bias and the author's perspective. In an academic or professional context, the ability to discern underlying viewpoints and potential biases is crucial for informed decision-making, accurate interpretation of data, and effective communication. Misinterpreting bias can lead to flawed conclusions, poor judgment, and a failure to consider alternative viewpoints, all of which have significant implications in academic and professional settings. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic and objective analysis of the text. This means looking for specific linguistic cues, the selection or omission of information, the framing of arguments, and the overall tone. It requires comparing the presented information against known facts or established principles, if available, or considering what perspectives might be missing. This aligns with the core principles of critical thinking and academic integrity, which are fundamental to the test of essential academic skills. By focusing on the evidence within the text and considering potential authorial intent or influence, the candidate demonstrates an ability to engage with material thoughtfully and analytically, a key skill assessed by the exam. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to accept the text's claims at face value without any critical evaluation. This fails to demonstrate the analytical skills the exam aims to assess. It represents a passive consumption of information rather than an active, critical engagement. Ethically and academically, this approach can lead to the uncritical acceptance of misinformation or biased viewpoints, undermining the pursuit of knowledge and objective understanding. Another incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the author's personal background or presumed motivations without concrete textual evidence. While authorial background can sometimes provide context, it is not a substitute for analyzing the text itself for bias. This approach risks making unsubstantiated assumptions and engaging in ad hominem reasoning, which is a logical fallacy and professionally unsound. It deviates from the requirement to analyze the text's content and presentation. A third incorrect approach might be to dismiss the text entirely based on a single potentially biased statement, without considering the overall argument or the possibility of unintentional bias. This demonstrates a lack of nuanced understanding and an inability to conduct a balanced assessment. Professionally, this can lead to premature rejection of valuable information or perspectives, hindering comprehensive analysis. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach texts with a critical mindset, actively seeking to understand the author's perspective and identify any potential biases. This involves a multi-step process. 1. Initial reading. Read the text to grasp the main ideas and arguments. 2. Identifying claims. Note the key assertions made by the author. 3. Examining evidence. Evaluate the support provided for these claims. Is it sufficient, relevant, and credible? 4. Analyzing language. Pay attention to word choice, tone, and rhetorical devices. Do they reveal a particular slant or emotional appeal? 5. Considering omissions. What information might be missing? Whose voices are absent? 6. Evaluating perspective. What is the author's likely viewpoint or agenda? How does this influence the presentation of information? 7. Cross-referencing if possible. Compare the information with other sources to verify accuracy and identify discrepancies. By following this process, professionals can develop a more objective and comprehensive understanding of the material, leading to better informed decisions and more effective communication. Question 10. What factors determine the most effective method for identifying the central theme or primary objective within a given written text? Option A. The length and complexity of the sentences used in the writing. Option B. The frequency of specific keywords and recurring phrases throughout the text. Option C. The document's stated purpose, the author's main argument or thesis, and the key supporting evidence presented. Option D. A summary of only the introductory and concluding paragraphs of the document. The correct answer is C. The document's stated purpose, the author's main argument or thesis, and the key supporting evidence presented. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to synthesize information from multiple sources and identify the core message or purpose of a complex document. The challenge lies in distinguishing between supporting details, tangential information, and the central argument or objective, especially when the document might be lengthy or written in technical language. Careful judgment is required to avoid misinterpreting the author's intent or overlooking critical components. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it involves a systematic and critical reading strategy. This strategy prioritizes identifying the document's purpose, the author's main thesis or argument, and the key supporting evidence or conclusions. This aligns with the fundamental principle of effective communication and comprehension, which is essential for informed decision-making and accurate reporting in any professional context. Understanding the main idea ensures that subsequent actions or interpretations are based on a solid grasp of the core content, thereby minimizing errors and promoting efficiency. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach focuses solely on identifying keywords or frequently repeated terms. This is a regulatory and ethical failure because it is a superficial method that can lead to misinterpretation. Keywords can be used in various contexts, and their repetition does not necessarily indicate their centrality to the main idea. This approach risks overlooking the nuanced argument or the overall purpose of the document, potentially leading to inaccurate summaries or decisions. Another incorrect approach involves summarizing only the introductory and concluding paragraphs. While these sections often contain important information, they may not fully encapsulate the main idea, especially in documents that develop complex arguments or present significant findings in the body. This approach is an ethical failure as it can lead to an incomplete or misleading understanding of the material, failing to uphold the professional duty of thoroughness and accuracy. A further incorrect approach is to focus on the length or complexity of the sentences. Sentence structure and complexity are stylistic elements and do not directly correlate with the main idea. This approach is a professional failure because it diverts attention from the content to form, leading to a superficial engagement with the material and a high probability of missing the central message. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that involves active reading and critical analysis. This includes previewing the document to understand its structure and potential purpose, reading with a focus on identifying the thesis statement or central argument, looking for topic sentences and paragraphs, and noting how evidence supports the main points. Professionals should also consider the author's intended audience and purpose. If unsure, rereading key sections or seeking clarification are essential steps to ensure a comprehensive understanding of the main idea. Question 11. When evaluating the suitability of a financial product based on a client's projected financial growth, which approach best demonstrates adherence to the principles of the test of essential academic skills, TEAS, framework and sound financial advisory practice? Option A. Prioritizing the product that offers the highest potential return based on a simplified algebraic projection, even if the underlying assumptions are not fully disclosed to the client. Option B. Ensuring the algebraic expression used for projection is derived from a source that aligns with the TEAS framework's emphasis on clear and logical reasoning, and then assessing the product's alignment with the client's stated financial goals and risk profile. Option C. Using a complex algebraic formula that is difficult for the client to understand, to impress them with the sophistication of the analysis, regardless of its practical applicability to their situation. Option D. Focusing on the mathematical accuracy of the algebraic expression representing the projected growth, without considering the client's risk tolerance or the product's underlying fees. The correct answer is D. Focusing on the mathematical accuracy of the algebraic expression representing the projected growth, without considering the client's risk tolerance or the product's underlying fees. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to interpret and apply a set of rules, the regulatory framework, to a specific situation involving financial advice. The core difficulty lies in ensuring that the advice provided is not only technically sound, but also compliant with the governing regulations, thereby protecting the client and upholding professional integrity. Careful judgment is required to navigate potential ambiguities in the rules and to avoid conflicts of interest or misrepresentations. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes adherence to the established regulatory framework. Specifically, it involves a thorough understanding of the test of essential academic skills, TEAS, guidelines, and any associated financial advisory regulations. This ensures that all evaluations of algebraic expressions within the context of financial advice are conducted in a manner that is transparent, accurate, and in the client's best interest, as mandated by regulatory bodies. This approach demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and regulatory compliance, which are fundamental to maintaining trust and credibility in the financial services industry. An incorrect approach that involves prioritizing personal gain over regulatory requirements would constitute a serious ethical and regulatory failure. This could manifest as recommending products or strategies based on commission structures rather than suitability for the client, thereby violating fiduciary duties and potentially leading to mis-selling. Another incorrect approach, such as overlooking or misinterpreting specific clauses within the TEAS framework or relevant financial regulations, could result in unintentional noncompliance. This might lead to inadequate risk assessments or inappropriate advice, exposing both the client and the professional to legal and financial repercussions. Such failures undermine the integrity of the financial advice process and can result in disciplinary action, fines, or loss of license. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive understanding of the applicable regulatory landscape, including the TEAS guidelines. This framework should involve a systematic review of the client's situation against these regulations, identifying any potential conflicts or areas requiring specific attention. When evaluating algebraic expressions in a financial context, professionals must ask, does this evaluation and the resulting advice align with the spirit and letter of the TEAS framework and all other relevant financial regulations? If there is any doubt, seeking clarification from compliance departments or legal counsel is a crucial step. This proactive and diligent approach ensures that all actions are defensible and ethically sound. Question 12. Quality control measures reveal that some production batch records are using a mixture of metric and imperial units for recording the weight of raw materials, despite the company's standard operating procedures and regulatory guidelines clearly specifying the exclusive use of the metric system for all weight measurements. Which of the following actions best upholds regulatory compliance and professional integrity? Option A. Continue using the mixed units as long as the total quantity can be accurately calculated, assuming the end user can perform conversions if needed. Option B. Immediately redocument all affected batch records to exclusively use metric units for weight, investigate the cause of the discrepancy, and reinforce training on the correct unit of measurement. Option C. Update the standard operating procedures to allow for the use of both metric and imperial units for weight measurements to accommodate historical data and ease of use for some personnel. Option D. Inform the regulatory body of the discrepancy and await their instructions on how to rectify the batch records without making any immediate changes. The correct answer is B. Immediately redocument all affected batch records to exclusively use metric units for weight, investigate the cause of the discrepancy, and reinforce training on the correct unit of measurement. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the accurate and consistent application of measurement units within a regulated environment, where deviations can have significant implications for product quality, safety, and compliance. The challenge lies in ensuring that all personnel understand and adhere to the specified units of measurement, preventing errors that could lead to non-compliance with industry standards or regulatory requirements. Careful judgment is required to identify and rectify any inconsistencies promptly. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes adherence to the established regulatory framework and internal quality control procedures, ensuring that all measurements are recorded and reported using the specified units, e.g., metric system for length, area, volume, and weight as per common international standards, and often mandated by regulatory bodies for consistency in global trade. It upholds the integrity of the data. This aligns with the principle of accuracy and reliability in all professional dealings, which is a cornerstone of regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. It demonstrates a commitment to quality and a proactive approach to risk management. An incorrect approach that involves using a mix of imperial and metric units without clear justification or conversion would be a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This introduces ambiguity and increases the likelihood of errors in interpretation and application, potentially leading to product defects or misrepresentation of quantities. Such an approach violates the principle of clarity and precision, which are fundamental to regulatory compliance. Furthermore, it could contravene specific regulations that mandate the use of particular units for reporting or labeling. Another incorrect approach, such as relying on estimations or approximations for critical measurements instead of precise units, would also constitute a regulatory and ethical failure. This undermines the accuracy and reliability of the data, which is essential for quality control and regulatory oversight. It demonstrates a lack of diligence and a disregard for established standards, potentially leading to noncompliance and safety concerns. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the relevant regulatory framework and its specific requirements regarding units of measurement. Professionals must prioritize accuracy, consistency, and clarity in all data handling. When inconsistencies are identified, the immediate and correct course of action is to revert to the specified units, investigate the root cause of the deviation, and implement corrective actions to prevent recurrence. This involves a commitment to continuous improvement and a proactive stance on quality assurance, ensuring that all operations align with regulatory expectations and ethical standards. Question 13. The control framework reveals that a financial advisor is explaining the projected growth of a client's retirement savings using a linear function graph. The client expresses confusion about what the upward sloping line signifies. Which of the following explanations best ensures the client's comprehension and adherence to regulatory disclosure requirements? Option A. Focusing on the aesthetic appeal of the graph and its ability to convey a sense of financial progress. Option B. explaining that the upward slope represents the rate at which their savings are expected to increase over time, with the starting point of the line indicating their initial investment. Option C, stating that the graph illustrates the compounding interest, which is a complex financial concept. Option D, describing the graph as a visual representation of market volatility and potential downturns. Correct answer is B, explaining that the upward slope represents the rate at which their savings are expected to increase over time, with the starting point of the line indicating their initial investment. Explanation. The control framework reveals that a financial advisor is presenting a client with a graphical representation of their investment portfolio's performance over time. The client, who has limited financial literacy, is struggling to interpret the visual data. This scenario is professionally challenging because the advisor has a fiduciary duty to ensure the client fully understands the information presented, especially when it pertains to their financial well-being. Misinterpretation of a linear function graph, such as confusing slope with absolute growth or misinterpreting the y-intercept as initial investment, could lead to poor financial decisions. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes client comprehension and transparency, aligning with regulatory expectations for clear and accurate communication. Specifically, it involves explaining the graph in plain language, defining key components like the axis, the slope, rate of change, and the intercept starting point or baseline, and relating these directly to the client's investment performance. This ensures the client can make informed decisions based on a true understanding of their portfolio's trajectory, fulfilling the advisor's ethical and regulatory obligations to act in the client's best interest. An incorrect approach that involves simply pointing to the graph and stating it shows growth without further explanation fails to meet the standard of care. This is a regulatory failure because it does not ensure the client's understanding, potentially leading to misinformed decisions. Ethically, it breaches the duty of care by not adequately educating the client. Another incorrect approach, such as using complex financial jargon to describe the graph's features, is also a regulatory and ethical failure. It demonstrates a lack of consideration for the client's financial literacy and an inability to communicate effectively, hindering informed decision-making. A third incorrect approach, focusing solely on the visual appeal of the graph without explaining its underlying meaning, is a failure to provide material information, which is a direct regulatory violation and an ethical lapse in transparency. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with assessing the client's level of understanding. They must then tailor their communication to bridge any knowledge gaps, using clear, concise language and relatable analogies. The core principle is to ensure the client can independently interpret and act upon the information provided, thereby empowering them to make sound financial choices. This proactive approach to client education is fundamental to maintaining trust and adhering to regulatory standards. Question 14. The assessment process reveals that a financial advisor is evaluating two competing investment proposals. Proposal Alpha is presented with compelling charts and graphs that highlight potential high returns, accompanied by testimonials from satisfied investors. Proposal Beta, while less visually engaging, provides detailed financial statements, independent analyst reports, and a clear breakdown of associated risks. The advisor must decide which proposal to recommend based on the presented information. Option A. Base the decision primarily on which proposal's presenter seemed more confident and articulate during the initial briefing, as confidence often correlates with the quality of the investment. Option B. Prioritize Proposal Alpha due to its visually appealing presentation and positive testimonials, as these indicate strong market appeal and investor confidence. Option C. Focus on Proposal Beta, meticulously examining the detailed financial statements, independent analyst reports, and risk assessments to form a well-reasoned recommendation. Option D. Recommend Proposal Alpha immediately, as the enthusiastic testimonials suggest a proven track record and a high probability of success, making further investigation unnecessary. The correct answer is B. Prioritize Proposal Alpha due to its visually appealing presentation and positive testimonials, as these indicate strong market appeal and investor confidence. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the individual to critically evaluate conflicting information and determine the most reliable evidence to support a conclusion. The challenge lies in discerning between persuasive rhetoric and factual, verifiable data, especially when the data might be presented in a way that favors a particular outcome. Professionals must exercise sound judgment to avoid being swayed by biased or incomplete evidence, which could lead to flawed decision-making and potentially negative consequences for clients or stakeholders. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves prioritizing evidence that is objective, verifiable, and directly relevant to the argument being made. This aligns with professional standards of due diligence and ethical conduct, which mandate that decisions be based on sound reasoning and credible information. By seeking out independent verification and considering the source's potential biases, the professional demonstrates a commitment to accuracy and integrity, ensuring that conclusions are robust and defensible. This methodical approach minimizes the risk of misinterpretation and upholds the professional's responsibility to provide reliable advice or analysis. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves accepting the presented data at face value without independent verification. This fails to meet professional standards of skepticism and due diligence. Ethically, it could lead to providing advice based on inaccurate or misleading information, potentially harming clients. Regulatory frameworks often require professionals to exercise reasonable care and skill, which includes verifying information from multiple sources. Another incorrect approach is to be unduly influenced by the persuasive language or emotional appeal of the evidence, even if the underlying data is weak or unsubstantiated. This demonstrates a lack of critical thinking and an inability to separate rhetoric from substance. Professionally, this can lead to biased judgments and a failure to uphold objectivity. Ethically, it breaches the duty of impartiality and can result in decisions that are not in the best interest of those relying on the professional's expertise. A further incorrect approach is to dismiss evidence solely because it contradicts a pre-existing belief or hypothesis. While healthy skepticism is important, outright dismissal without proper evaluation can lead to confirmation bias and a failure to consider all relevant information. This hinders objective analysis and can result in incomplete or flawed conclusions, which is a failure of professional responsibility. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic approach to evaluating arguments and evidence. This involves 1. Identifying the core argument or conclusion. 2. Identifying the evidence presented to support the argument. 3. Assessing the credibility and relevance of each piece of evidence. This includes considering the source, potential biases, methodology if applicable, and whether the evidence is verifiable. 4. Seeking corroborating evidence from independent and reliable sources. 5. Considering alternative explanations or counterarguments. 6. Forming a conclusion based on the weight of credible evidence rather than on persuasive language or pre-existing beliefs. 7. Being prepared to revise conclusions if new, credible evidence emerges. Question 15. System analysis indicates that a candidate is presented with a conceptual representation of a data processing rule. This rule involves abstract symbols that can represent different values and operations that define how these symbols interact. The candidate must determine the fundamental nature of this rule. Which of the following best describes the core characteristic of this rule? Option A. It is a defined sequence of operations to be performed on symbolic placeholders. Option B. It is a collection of independent symbolic placeholders. Option C. It is a fixed numerical outcome determined by the symbols. Option D. It is a set of potential values that the symbols might represent. Correct answer is A. It is a defined sequence of operations to be performed on symbolic placeholders. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to interpret and apply abstract concepts, variables, and expressions within a practical, albeit simulated, context. The challenge lies in moving beyond rote memorization of definitions to understanding how these concepts function and how their manipulation can lead to different outcomes, even without explicit numerical values. Careful judgment is required to discern the fundamental nature of the components and their relationships. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it demonstrates a deep understanding of how variables act as placeholders and how expressions represent a set of operations to be performed on those placeholders. It correctly identifies that the core of an expression is its structure and the operations it dictates, irrespective of the specific values assigned to the variables. This aligns with the foundational principles of logic and symbolic representation, which are crucial for understanding complex systems and data structures, a core competency assessed by the T's. Incorrect approach is analysis, an approach that focuses solely on the potential numerical output without considering the underlying structure is professionally unacceptable. This fails to grasp the essence of an expression as a process or a rule. It represents a superficial understanding, akin to only knowing the destination without understanding the journey. Ethically, this could lead to misinterpretations in data analysis or system design, where the process is more critical than a single outcome. An approach that treats variables as fixed values rather than dynamic placeholders is also professionally unacceptable. This misunderstands the fundamental purpose of variables in allowing for flexibility and generalization. It limits the applicability of the concept and can lead to rigid and inefficient problem solving. This failure to grasp the dynamic nature of variables can result in flawed logical constructs. An approach that ignores the operators within an expression and focuses only on the variables is professionally unacceptable. This demonstrates a failure to understand that an expression is defined by both its components, variables, and the relationships or actions between them, operators. It is like understanding the ingredients of a recipe, but ignoring the cooking instructions. This leads to an incomplete and inaccurate understanding of how information is processed or transformed. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such questions by first identifying the core components: variables, placeholders, and operators, actions/relationships. They should then analyze how these components interact to form an expression, which represents a rule or a process. The focus should be on the structural integrity and the logical flow of operations, rather than anticipating specific numerical results, which are dependent on external assignments to variables. This systematic breakdown ensures a robust understanding of the underlying principles. Question 16. Process analysis reveals that a standardized procedure for plotting geographical data points requires strict adherence to foundational principles of spatial representation. Which of the following best describes the essential coordinate geometry concept that underpins the accurate execution of this plotting procedure? Option A. The determination of the slope of a line segment connecting two points. Option B. The identification of the midpoint of a line segment. Option C. The calculation of the distance between 2 points using the Pythagorean theorem. Option D. The definition of a point as an ordered pair of coordinates x, y on a Cartesian plane. Correct answer is D. The definition of a point as an ordered pair of coordinates x, y on a Cartesian plane. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to interpret and apply fundamental coordinate geometry concepts within a context that demands adherence to specific procedural guidelines, rather than direct calculation. The challenge lies in understanding the underlying principles of how points and lines are defined and related in a two-dimensional plane, and how these principles inform the correct execution of a process. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between a superficial understanding and a deep grasp of the foundational elements that govern spatial relationships. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it demonstrates an understanding that the foundational principles of coordinate geometry, such as the definition of a point by its x and y coordinates, and the concept of a line as a set of points satisfying a specific equation, are the essential building blocks for any process involving spatial representation or manipulation. Adhering to these basics ensures that the process is robust, logically sound, and can be reliably executed. This aligns with professional standards that emphasize understanding the why behind procedures, not just the how. In a regulatory context, this foundational understanding is critical for ensuring data integrity and process accuracy, which are often subject to audit and compliance checks. Incorrect approach is analysis. An approach that focuses solely on memorizing a sequence of steps without understanding the coordinate geometry principles behind them is professionally unacceptable. This represents a failure to grasp the underlying logic, making the process vulnerable to errors if any deviation from the memorized steps occurs, or if a novel situation arises. Ethically, it can lead to misrepresentation of understanding and potentially flawed outcomes. An approach that attempts to apply advanced mathematical concepts not relevant to the basic definition of points and lines in coordinate geometry is also professionally flawed. This demonstrates a misunderstanding of the scope and requirements of the task, potentially leading to overcomplication and incorrect application of principles. It suggests a lack of focus on the core requirements of the process, an approach that dismisses the importance of coordinate geometry entirely, viewing it as irrelevant to the task, is a significant professional and ethical failure. This indicates a fundamental lack of understanding of how spatial data is represented and manipulated, which is often a prerequisite for many operational processes. It can lead to the development or execution of processes that are fundamentally unsound and incapable of producing accurate results. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach tasks involving spatial concepts by first identifying the core principles of coordinate geometry that are relevant. This involves understanding how points are defined by ordered pairs and how lines are represented by equations. The decision-making process should then focus on how these fundamental principles directly inform and validate each step of the given process. If a process appears to deviate from these basics, it warrants further investigation to ensure its integrity and accuracy. This systematic approach ensures that decisions are grounded in sound theoretical understanding, leading to reliable and compliant outcomes. Question 17. The performance metrics show a significant increase in client complaints related to service delivery over the last quarter. When reviewing the internal incident reports to understand the root causes, which analytical approach to the structure of these reports is most likely to reveal systemic issues and support effective risk mitigation? Option A. Prioritizing reports authored by senior management for a more authoritative perspective on the issues. Option B. Counting the total number of words used in each report to assess the level of detail provided. Option C. Examining how the reports are organized to determine if critical information, such as the nature of the complaint, the date of occurrence, and the assigned resolution team, is presented logically and prominently. Option D. Focusing on the frequency of technical jargon and industry-specific terms to gauge the report's sophistication. The correct answer is C. Examining how the reports are organized to determine if critical information, such as the nature of the complaint, the date of occurrence, and the assigned resolution team, is presented logically and prominently. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to interpret complex performance data and identify potential underlying issues that could impact client outcomes and regulatory compliance. The ability to analyze text structure within reports is crucial for discerning the clarity, completeness, and potential biases of information presented. Careful judgment is required to move beyond surface-level observations and identify systemic problems or areas needing improvement. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it involves a systematic and critical examination of the report structure to identify how information is presented, organized, and communicated. This allows for an assessment of whether the structure facilitates understanding, highlights key risks, and supports informed decision-making. By focusing on the logical flow, clarity of headings, and the placement of critical information, a professional can determine if the report effectively communicates its message and supports the intended purpose, aligning with principles of transparency and accountability expected under relevant regulatory frameworks that emphasize clear and understandable reporting. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the length of the report fails to engage with the substance of the information or its presentation. Regulatory frameworks often mandate that reports be comprehensive, but also concise and to the point, making length alone an insufficient metric for quality. This approach risks overlooking critical details or misinterpreting the significance of the content. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes the number of charts and graphs without evaluating their relevance or clarity is also professionally unacceptable. While visual aids can enhance understanding, an excessive or poorly designed use of graphics can obscure information, introduce bias, or lead to misinterpretation. Regulatory guidelines often stress the importance of accurate and appropriate data presentation, and this approach neglects that. A further incorrect approach that solely considers the author's seniority ignores the objective quality of the report's content and structure. Professional standards require that reports be evaluated on their merit, not on the perceived authority of their author. This approach introduces bias and can lead to the acceptance of poorly constructed or misleading information, which is a failure of due diligence and professional integrity. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that involves 1. Understanding the purpose and audience of the report. 2. deconstructing the report's structure to assess logical flow, clarity of arguments, and organization of information. 3. Critically evaluating the content within the context of its structure to identify strengths, weaknesses, and potential risks. 4. Considering relevant regulatory and ethical obligations that guide reporting standards and client communication. Question 18. Benchmark analysis indicates that understanding the core message of a literary work requires more than simply summarizing the plot. When analyzing a novel about a character's journey through a dystopian society, which approach most effectively identifies the central theme? Option A. Describing the physical characteristics of the dystopian city and its inhabitants. Option B. Examining how the protagonist's internal struggles and evolving worldview reflect broader societal critiques. Option C. Focusing on the exciting plot twists and the protagonist's immediate survival tactics. Option D. Prioritizing the reader's personal feelings of fear or hope evoked by the story. The correct answer is B. Examining how the protagonist's internal struggles and evolving worldview reflect broader societal critiques. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the careful interpretation of a literary text to identify its underlying themes, which can be subjective and open to multiple valid readings. The challenge lies in moving beyond superficial plot points to discern the author's deeper message or commentary on human nature, society, or the human condition. This requires analytical skills that go beyond simple comprehension, demanding an understanding of how literary devices contribute to meaning. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it involves a systematic and evidence-based method for analyzing literary elements. By focusing on recurring motifs, character development, symbolic imagery, and the overall narrative arc, one can build a well-supported argument for a particular theme. This aligns with academic and professional standards for literary analysis, which value reasoned interpretation grounded in textual evidence. It demonstrates a commitment to thoroughness and intellectual rigor, essential for credible analysis. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the protagonist's immediate actions without considering their broader implications or the context of the narrative fails to engage with the deeper thematic layers of the text. This is a failure of analytical depth. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes the reader's personal emotional response over textual evidence risks introducing bias and subjectivity, leading to an interpretation that is not demonstrably supported by the work itself. This lacks the objectivity required for sound literary analysis. A third incorrect approach that dismisses the importance of the setting and its symbolic resonance overlooks a crucial element that often contributes significantly to the thematic development of a literary work. The setting is rarely merely a backdrop. It frequently embodies or influences the central ideas. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a close reading of the text, identifying key literary elements. This is followed by an iterative process of hypothesis generation regarding potential themes, testing these hypotheses against the textual evidence, and refining the interpretation based on the strength of that evidence. This process emphasizes critical thinking, evidence-based reasoning, and an awareness of the potential for multiple valid interpretations, while still striving for the most robust and well-supported conclusion. Question 19. Strategic planning requires a thorough understanding of the processes necessary to ensure the accuracy and integrity of financial data before it is presented to stakeholders. If a manager requests preliminary financial figures for an upcoming strategic meeting, but the standard reconciliation process has not yet been completed, what is the most appropriate course of action to maintain regulatory compliance? Option A. Provide the preliminary figures, clearly stating that they are unaudited and subject to change after the full reconciliation process is completed. Option B. Compile the figures based on the most recent available data, assuming the reconciliation will confirm them and present them as final. Option C. Inform the manager that no figures can be provided until the reconciliation process is fully finalized and verified, even if it means missing the meeting deadline. Option D. Delegate the task of providing the figures to a junior team member who can quickly gather the available data without a full review. Correct answer is A. Provide the preliminary figures, clearly stating that they are unaudited and subject to change after the full reconciliation process is completed. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to balance the immediate need for financial information with the regulatory obligation to ensure the accuracy and integrity of that information. The pressure to provide data quickly can lead to shortcuts that compromise compliance. Careful judgment is required to identify and adhere to the correct procedural steps mandated by the regulatory framework. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes adherence to the established regulatory framework for financial reporting. This framework, designed to ensure transparency and investor protection, dictates specific procedures for data validation and reconciliation before any information is disseminated. By following these steps, the professional upholds the integrity of financial reporting, which is a cornerstone of regulatory compliance and builds trust with stakeholders. This aligns with the test of essential academic skills emphasis on understanding and applying foundational principles within a defined context. An incorrect approach that involves providing preliminary, unverified figures fails to meet the regulatory requirement for accuracy and completeness. This constitutes a breach of professional conduct and potentially violates regulations that mandate the submission of audited or properly reconciled financial data. Providing such information without appropriate caveats or verification can mislead stakeholders and lead to significant regulatory penalties. Another incorrect approach, which is to delay providing any information until absolute certainty is achieved, while prioritizing accuracy, can also be problematic. While accuracy is paramount, an unreasonable delay can hinder timely decision-making by stakeholders and may contravene regulations that stipend reporting timelines. The challenge lies in finding the appropriate balance between speed and accuracy, guided by regulatory expectations for interim reporting. A further incorrect approach, which is to rely solely on the input of a single department without independent verification, introduces a significant risk of error and misrepresentation. Regulatory frameworks typically require cross-checking and independent validation of financial data to mitigate the impact of individual biases or errors. Failure to implement such checks can lead to the dissemination of inaccurate information, a direct violation of regulatory principles. The professional reasoning process should involve a clear understanding of the relevant regulatory requirements for financial reporting, including any specific guidelines on the timing and accuracy of data dissemination. When faced with pressure to provide information, the professional should first assess the regulatory obligations. If preliminary data is permissible, it must be clearly identified as such and accompanied by appropriate disclaimers. If not, the professional must communicate the timeline for providing verified information, explaining the necessary validation steps. This systematic approach ensures that both operational needs and regulatory compliance are addressed responsibly. Question 20. Process analysis reveals that an analyst is reviewing a series of internal memos regarding a new product launch. One memo, written by a junior marketing associate, uses highly enthusiastic language, exclamation points, and focuses heavily on potential market share gains, while another, from a senior product manager, uses more measured language, highlights potential technical challenges, and emphasizes the need for further testing. The analyst needs to assess the overall risk associated with the product launch, which approach best facilitates an accurate risk assessment. Option A. Analyze both memos, considering the author's role, the specific language used, and the context to understand the differing perspectives on potential risks and rewards. Option B. Discount the senior product manager's memo due to its cautious tone, as it may indicate a lack of confidence or an attempt to hinder the launch. Option C. Focus on the enthusiastic language in the junior associate's memo to gauge the team's overall morale and commitment to the product. Option D. Prioritize the memo with the most optimistic projections, as it likely reflects the most current and forward-looking sentiment regarding the product's success. The correct answer is D. Prioritize the memo with the most optimistic projections, as it likely reflects the most current and forward-looking sentiment regarding the product's success. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the analyst to discern the underlying purpose and tone of a communication, which can be subtle and influenced by various factors. Misinterpreting the author's intent could lead to flawed risk assessments, potentially impacting investment decisions or regulatory compliance. The pressure to deliver a timely analysis adds to the complexity, as rushing can lead to overlooking crucial nuances. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough examination of the language used, considering both explicit statements and implicit meanings. This includes analyzing word choice, sentence structure, and the overall context of the communication. By focusing on the author's likely intent, whether to inform, persuade, or caution, and the emotional or attitudinal stance conveyed, tone, the analyst can accurately assess the potential risks. This aligns with professional standards of diligence and accuracy in financial analysis, ensuring that all relevant information, including subtle cues, is considered to form a well-grounded opinion. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to solely focus on the factual content of the communication, ignoring any underlying sentiment or persuasive intent. This fails to recognize that an author's purpose is not always purely informational, and that tone can significantly alter the perceived meaning and potential implications of the information presented. This oversight could lead to underestimating risks if the author is subtly downplaying negative aspects, or overestimating risks if the author is using alarmist language without substantial factual backing. This approach lacks the depth of analysis required for a comprehensive risk assessment and could violate professional obligations to exercise due care and thoroughness. Another incorrect approach would be to project personal biases or assumptions onto the author's communication. This involves interpreting the message through a preconceived lens, rather than objectively evaluating the author's words and context. Such an approach is subjective and unreliable, leading to a distorted understanding of the author's purpose and tone. This can result in inaccurate risk assessments and a failure to meet professional standards of objectivity and impartiality. It also risks misrepresenting the author's actual position, which can have ethical implications. A further incorrect approach would be to dismiss the communication as irrelevant without a proper assessment of its potential impact. This might occur if the analyst perceives the author's tone as overly aggressive or informal, leading them to discount the substance of the message. However, even communications with an unusual tone can contain critical information or signal important shifts in perspective or strategy. Failing to analyze such communications thoroughly represents a failure to exercise professional skepticism and diligence, potentially missing crucial risk indicators. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by first identifying the primary objective of the communication. Is it to report facts, advocate for position, warn of danger, or something else? Simultaneously, they should analyze the tone. Is it objective, optimistic, pessimistic, urgent, or dismissive? This dual analysis allows for a more nuanced understanding of the author's intent and the potential implications of their message. Professionals should then cross-reference the communication with other available information and consider the author's known affiliations and past communications to build a comprehensive picture. This systematic approach, grounded in objective analysis and contextual understanding, ensures that risk assessments are robust and defensible.